The champagne flute slipped from my trembling fingers, crystals shattering against the marble floor of the country club ballroom, but the sound was nothing compared to the silence that followed my words. 200 faces stared at me in horror, their expressions a mixture of shock and disgust that I'd never seen directed at me before. What had I just done? The woman in the navy dress blues stood frozen, her hand still extended where she'd been reaching to congratulate my daughter. The medals on her chest caught the light from the chandeliers, each one a testament to service I'd just spat on with my venomous tongue. Her face had gone pale, but her posture remained rigid, military discipline holding her together even as I'd tried to tear her apart. And behind her, through the ballroom's French doors, I could see them. Men in identical dress uniforms, their faces stone-cold serious, filing in one by one like an unstoppable tide. My perfect daughter's perfect wedding had just become my nightmare. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Margaret Thornfield, and until that moment I thought I owned the world. At 62, I had everything I'd ever wanted. A mansion in Beacon Hill overlooking Boston Harbor, a husband who ran the most successful investment firm in New England, and a daughter who just married into pharmaceutical royalty. The Ashworth name opened doors that money alone couldn't budge. When people heard Thornfield, they thought power, influence, old money that spoke in whispers and moved mountains. The wedding had been flawless until she walked in. 3 months of planning, $50,000 in flowers alone, and a guest list that read like the Forbes billionaire index. Everything had been curated to perfection, from the hand-calligraphed invitations to the imported Italian marble dance floor. This was supposed to be my crowning achievement, the social event that would cement the Thornfield legacy for generations. I'd been standing near the champagne fountain, accepting congratulations from Senator Blackwood's wife, when I spotted her. She couldn't have been more than 30, with short auburn hair and the kind of posture that screamed military from across the room. The dress blues were immaculate, but she looked completely out of place among the Vera Wang gowns and Armani tuxedos. My first thought was confusion. Who had invited someone so obviously beneath our social circle? Then I saw her talking to my daughter Charlotte. My beautiful, radiant Charlotte in her custom Monique Lhuillier gown, worth more than most people's cars. They were laughing together, and Charlotte's face lit up in a way I hadn't seen since she was a child. The woman's hand rested gently on Charlotte's arm, and there was an intimacy in their conversation that made my stomach clench with unease. I'd worked too hard to let some nobody ruin this day. The guest list had been vetted with military precision. Every name had been approved by both families. Charity cases and strays had no place at an Ashworth Thornfield wedding. I set my champagne down and smoothed my Chanel suit, preparing to handle the situation with the diplomatic grace that had made me the most feared hostess in Boston high society. But as I approached, I caught fragments of their conversation that stopped me cold. The woman was telling Charlotte about someone named Rachel, about how proud she would have been to see this day. Charlotte's eyes were bright with unshed tears, but they were happy tears, the kind that come from deep gratitude. Rachel. My blood ran cold. Charlotte had mentioned that name before, years ago, when she'd come home from college changed. Quieter, more serious, with a new appreciation for things I'd never taught her to value. She'd talked about a friend who'd helped her through her darkest period, who'd saved her life in ways I'd never fully understood. A friend who'd died serving our country. The pieces clicked together like a lock turning. This woman wasn't some random gatecrasher. She was connected to Rachel, which meant she was connected to a part of Charlotte's life I'd spent years trying to erase. The part that had threatened to derail all my carefully laid plans for her future. I remembered those phone calls from Charlotte's sophomore year at Harvard. She'd been struggling, falling behind in her pre-law coursework, talking about changing majors to something, quote, meaningful. She'd wanted to drop out entirely, to join some ridiculous volunteer program that would have wasted her Harvard education and embarrassed the family name. I'd talked her out of it, reminded her of her obligations, her future, the life we'd planned for her since birth. But someone else had been talking to her too. This Rachel person, filling her head with ideas about service and sacrifice that had no place in a Thornfield's worldview. Charlotte had mentioned her constantly during those troubling months, how Rachel was teaching her about courage and purpose and other concepts that had no practical value in our world. When Rachel died in some Middle Eastern conflict, I'd been secretly relieved. Not that I'd wished death on anyone, but her influence over Charlotte had been problematic. Without that distraction, Charlotte had refocused on her studies, graduated summa cum laude, and gone on to meet David Ashworth at a charity gala I'd specifically arranged. Everything had worked out exactly as planned. Now on Charlotte's wedding day, here was another military woman threatening to resurrect those memories. I could see it in Charlotte's face, the way she was looking at this stranger with the same reverence she'd once reserved for her dead friend. This woman was going to undo years of careful conditioning, remind Charlotte of dreams I'd spent a fortune helping her forget. The woman extended her hand to me as I approached, her smile genuine but cautious. She had intelligent green eyes and a small scar along her jawline that spoke of real combat experience. Up close, she was even younger than I'd thought, which somehow made her presence more offensive. This child thought she could walk into my world and command respect simply by wearing a uniform. "Mrs. Thornfield," she said, her voice carrying a slight Southern accent. "I'm Lieutenant Commander Sarah Mitchell. Charlotte invited me to share in this beautiful day. You should be very proud of her." Lieutenant Commander. So she outranked most of the military personnel I'd met at various charity functions. That made her potentially dangerous. People with rank had connections, influence within their own circles. If she decided to make Charlotte's wedding about military service or patriotic duty, she could turn my carefully orchestrated social event into some kind of recruitment poster. I took her hand briefly, noting the calluses that spoke of real work rather than the manicured softness of proper society. "How exactly do you know my daughter, Lieutenant?" "Through Rachel O'Connor," she said simply, and the name hit me like a physical blow. Rachel saved my life in Kandahar. Before she died, she told me about Charlotte, about how much their friendship meant to her. She made me promise that if I ever had the chance, I'd tell Charlotte how proud she was of the woman she'd become. The ballroom seemed to tilt around me. Rachel was supposed to be buried in the past, a regrettable detour in Charlotte's journey toward her proper destiny. Now this woman was standing at my daughter's wedding, ready to resurrect a ghost I'd worked so hard to exorcise. I glanced around quickly, noting which of our guests were within earshot. The Ashworth family patriarch was discussing politics with a Supreme Court justice near the ice sculpture. Senator Blackwood's entire family was clustered around the wedding cake, admiring the hand-piped sugar flowers. These were people who understood power, influence, the delicate dance of social hierarchy. They didn't need to hear some sob story about dead soldiers and misguided friendships. "I see," I said, my voice carrying the frost that had intimidated.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Lesser mortals for decades. Well, I'm sure Charlotte appreciates the sentiment, but perhaps this isn't the appropriate time or place for such discussions. This is a celebration, not a memorial service. Lieutenant Commander Mitchell's smile faltered slightly, but she maintained her composure. That military discipline again, the kind that could make even justified criticism slide off like water. It irritated me more than an emotional outburst would have. "Of course," she said. "I didn't mean to intrude. I just wanted Charlotte to know that Rachel's sacrifice wasn't forgotten, that the people she saved remember her kindness." Sacrifice. Kindness. The words grated against my nerves like fingernails on slate. This woman was speaking a language that had no place in my world, using concepts that belonged in recruitment brochures and war movies, not at a society wedding worth more than most people's houses. Charlotte was watching our exchange with growing tension, her wedding day joy fading into anxiety. She knew me well enough to recognize the signs of an impending social execution. I'd perfected the art of destroying unwanted guests with surgical precision, making them feel so uncomfortable they'd excuse themselves rather than face further humiliation. But this one wasn't backing down. She stood there in her dress blues like she belonged, like her presence was somehow justified by her service record and her connection to a dead girl's ghost. The audacity was breathtaking. "Mrs. Thornfield," Charlotte said quietly, stepping closer to us. "Sarah has traveled across the country to be here. Rachel meant everything to me during college, and Sarah was with her when she died. She brought me something of Rachel's that I've wanted for years." My daughter's words were a betrayal that cut deeper than any stranger's criticism. Charlotte was choosing sides, publicly aligning herself with this military woman, and her emotional baggage over her own mother's clearly expressed wishes. After everything I'd done to secure her future, she was willing to embarrass me in front of the most influential people in New England. The woman reached into her uniform jacket and withdrew a small wooden box, worn smooth by handling. Even from a distance, I could see Charlotte's breath catch, her eyes filling with the kind of tears that threatened carefully applied makeup. "Rachel asked me to make sure you got this," Sarah said, offering the box to Charlotte. "She said you'd understand what it meant." I watched in horror as my daughter accepted the box with trembling hands, cradling it like it contained the crown jewels. Whatever was inside that small wooden container represented everything I'd fought to erase from Charlotte's life. The sentimentality, the misguided loyalty to people who could never help her achieve her potential, the dangerous tendency to value emotion over advantage. The guests were beginning to notice our little drama. I could feel their attention like heat on my skin, their curiosity about the uniformed woman who'd captured the bride's focus. This was supposed to be about the Thornfield name, the Ashworth alliance, the careful joining of two powerful families. Instead, it was becoming a tribute to some dead nobody who'd filled my daughter's head with inappropriate ideas. "Charlotte," I said, my voice carrying the authority that had cowed corporate executives and political wives, "perhaps you should save such personal matters for a more private moment. Your guests are waiting." But Charlotte was already opening the box, her face transforming with a joy that made my chest tight with panic. Inside was a small silver compass, tarnished with age and obviously worthless from a monetary standpoint. But the way Charlotte held it, you'd have thought it was made of pure platinum. "She kept it," Charlotte whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Even over there, she kept it." "It never left her pocket," Sarah said gently. "She said it reminded her of home, of the people worth fighting for. She wanted you to have it back." Back. The word suggested a history I'd never been told, a connection between my daughter and her, dead friend that went deeper than I'd realized. Charlotte was crying now, real tears that would require makeup repair, and she didn't seem to care who was watching. The senator's wife was staring openly now, her expression a mixture of curiosity and disapproval. She'd donated millions to military charities over the years, but she understood the difference between writing checks and actual emotional investment. This kind of display was beneath the dignity of a proper society wedding. "This is completely inappropriate," I said, loud enough for nearby guests to hear. "Lieutenant, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. This is a private family celebration, not a public ceremony." Sarah Mitchell straightened to her full height, which was considerable. Up close, she had the kind of physical presence that came from real training, real combat experience. But she was still just one woman in a room full of people who answered to me, who owed their social standing to the same careful cultivation of power that had built the Thornfield empire. "Ma'am," she said, her voice respectful but firm, "Charlotte invited me personally. I have every right to be here. The defiance was the last straw. I'd tolerated enough insubordination for one evening." This woman was threatening to turn my daughter's wedding into some kind of military tribute, undermining years of careful social positioning, with her inappropriate emotional displays and her connection to a past I'd worked so hard to bury. "Rights?" I laughed, the sound sharp enough to cut crystal. "You think wearing that costume gives you rights in my world? This is a celebration of achievement, of success, of people who matter. My daughter has moved beyond her college mistakes, beyond her misguided friendships with people who threw their lives away for nothing. The words hung in the air like poison gas, spreading through the immediate area and infecting everyone within earshot. I could feel the shock ripple outward, see faces turning toward us with expressions ranging from fascination to horror. Sarah Mitchell's face had gone completely white, but her posture remained military straight. Around us, conversations died as my words sank in. The senator's wife was staring at me with undisguised disgust. Even the Ashworth family patriarch had turned from his political discussion to witness the carnage. "Mother," Charlotte whispered, her voice broken, "how could you say that?" But I was beyond caring about damage control. The rage that had been building all evening finally erupted, fed by years of frustration with Charlotte's misplaced loyalties, and my fear that this woman would undo everything I'd accomplished. "Your friend Rachel chose to throw her life away playing soldier in some godforsaken desert," I continued, my voice carrying across the ballroom like a whip crack. "She died for nothing, achieved nothing, left nothing behind except sad stories and worthless trinkets. That's not sacrifice, that's waste. And I won't have my daughter's future contaminated by association with such meaningless martyrdom." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the string quartet had stopped playing, their instruments frozen mid-note. 200 of Boston's most powerful people stood motionless, staring at me with expressions I'd never seen directed my way before. Not anger, not disagreement, but something much worse: revulsion. Sarah Mitchell stood perfectly still, her hands clasped behind her back in a parade rest position that somehow made her look more dignified than anyone else in the room. When she spoke, her voice was quiet, controlled, and infinitely more dangerous than any shouting could have been. "Rachel O'Connor died protecting a convoy of aid workers bringing medical supplies to an Afghan orphanage," she said, each word precise as a surgical cut. "She threw herself on a roadside bomb to save 12 civilians, including 3 children. She was awarded the Silver Star posthumously. Her sacrifice saved lives and exemplified the highest ideals of military service." Each fact hit me like a physical blow, but I couldn't stop myself now. The social suicide was already in motion, the damage spreading through the room like wildfire. I'd exposed myself completely, revealed the ugliness beneath the cultivated surface, and there was no taking it back. "Ideals don't pay for Harvard tuition," I snapped. "Heroism doesn't secure advantageous marriages or build family legacies. Your friend died young and poor, and forgotten by everyone, except sentimental children playing dress-up. At least Charlotte had the sense to grow up and join the real world." That's when I saw them through the French doors. Men in dress uniforms, moving with the kind of coordinated precision that spoke of serious training and serious purpose. They weren't walking randomly, they were advancing with military discipline, their faces set in expressions that promised consequences I wasn't prepared to face. The first one through the door was massive, his chest decorated with enough medals to open a museum. Behind him came another, then another, each one adding to the weight of judgment that was suddenly pressing down on the ballroom like a physical force. Charlotte dropped the compass, the small silver instrument hitting the marble floor with a sound like a gunshot. "Oh my God," she whispered, her face white with shock, and something that might have been hope. Sarah Mitchell turned toward the approaching uniforms, and for the first time all evening, she smiled. It wasn't a pleasant expression. It was the kind of smile that predators wore when they scented blood. "Ma'am," she said, her voice carrying a new note of satisfaction, "I'd like you to meet some friends of mine." The lead figure approached with measured steps, his gaze fixed on me with laser intensity. He was older than Sarah, probably in his 40s, with the kind of face that had seen things civilians couldn't imagine. The insignia on his uniform meant nothing to me, but the way every other uniformed person in the rapidly filling ballroom deferred to him suggested rank that demanded respect. "Master Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez," Sarah said, her voice carrying clearly across the silent room. "I'd like you to meet Mrs. Margaret Thornfield." She was just explaining her views on military service and sacrifice. Rodriguez stopped directly in front of me, close enough that I could see the small scars on his hands, the gray threading through his black hair, the absolute steadiness in his dark eyes. Behind him, the ballroom continued to fill with uniformed figures, each one adding to the sense that I was suddenly surrounded by forces I couldn't control or comprehend. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made senators nervous, "I understand you have some thoughts about the value of service members, sacrifices." The question hung in the air like a challenge I wasn't equipped to meet. Around us, Boston's elite watched in fascination and growing horror as their social world tilted on its axis. The careful hierarchies that governed our universe meant nothing to these men and women who answered to different authorities and followed different codes. I opened my mouth to respond, to reassert my position and regain control of the situation, but no words came. For the first time in my adult life, I was facing people who couldn't be bought, threatened, or socially maneuvered. They existed outside my world entirely, and they just made it clear that my world wasn't as safe or separate as I'd believed. The Master Chief waited patiently for my answer, his presence filling the space between us like a gathering storm. Behind him, more uniforms continued to arrive, their faces set in expressions that promised this conversation was far from over. Charlotte stood frozen between us, her wedding dress a white flag in a battle that was just beginning. The compass lay forgotten at her feet, its small silver surface reflecting the ballroom lights like a fallen star. And I realized, with growing terror, that my perfect evening had become something else entirely. A reckoning I'd never seen coming, delivered by people I'd spent my life dismissing as irrelevant. The Master Chief's patience seemed infinite, but I could feel the weight of 200 expectant gazes pressing down on me like a physical force. Some belonged to my social peers, people whose opinions had governed my life for decades. Others belonged to uniformed strangers, whose judgment operated by rules I'd never bothered to learn. "I believe there's been a misunderstanding," I managed, my voice sounding thin and artificial in the charged atmosphere. I was simply trying to maintain the appropriate tone for my daughter's wedding celebration. Rodriguez tilted his head slightly, the gesture somehow more intimidating than any aggressive posture could have been. "Appropriate tone," he repeated, as if testing the words for hidden meaning. "And you felt it appropriate to describe a Silver Star recipient as someone who died for nothing?" The question was delivered with surgical precision, cutting through my attempted deflection and exposing the raw ugliness of what I'd said. Around us, the silence deepened as more guests became aware of the confrontation. I could see phones being discreetly raised, social media posts being crafted that would destroy my reputation within hours. "Rachel O'Connor was my daughter's friend," Rodriguez continued, his voice carrying easily across the ballroom. "She saved my life in Helmand Province, pulled me out of a burning Humvee while under enemy fire. She was 24 years old, ma'am. 24, with her whole life ahead of her, and she chose to put herself between harm and innocent people." Each word landed like a physical blow, but I couldn't retreat now. Too many people were watching. Too much damage had already been done. My only hope was to brazen it out, to somehow reassert the social dominance that had protected me for so long. "I'm sure she was very brave," I said, forcing my voice to carry the condescending tone that had cowed lesser mortals for decades. "But bravery doesn't change the fact that she's gone while Charlotte is here, building a real life with real achievements. Some of us understand the difference between meaningful sacrifice and wasteful martyrdom." The words felt like poison in my mouth even as I spoke them, but I couldn't stop. Pride had always been my greatest weakness, and I'd built an identity around never backing down, never admitting error, never showing weakness to people I considered beneath me. Sarah Mitchell stepped forward, her face composed but her eyes blazing with controlled fury. "Wasteful martyrdom," she repeated. "Is that what you call it when someone dies protecting a school full of children?" "I call it a waste when bright young people throw away their futures for strangers who can't help them achieve anything meaningful," I shot back. My daughter learned that lesson and moved on to build something worthwhile with her life. The collective intake of breath from the surrounding crowd was audible. Even by my own standards, the cruelty of that statement was breathtaking. But I was committed now, trapped by my own momentum and the audience that made retreat impossible. Charlotte finally found her voice, but it came out as a broken whisper. "Mother, stop. Please, just stop." But stopping would mean acknowledging that I'd been wrong, that my worldview was flawed, that these people in their uniforms had something I didn't understand or value. It would mean admitting that Charlotte's college friendship had been more meaningful than all my careful social engineering. "Your daughter," Rodriguez said quietly, "invited Lieutenant Commander Mitchell here because she wanted to honor her friend's memory on one of the most important days of her life. She wanted to share her joy with someone who could tell her about Rachel's final moments, about how proud Rachel would have been to see this day." He paused, letting the weight of that sink in before continuing. "Instead, she got to watch her mother publicly humiliate a decorated war veteran and desecrate the memory of a woman who died protecting children. How do you think that makes her feel on her wedding day?" I looked at Charlotte then, really looked at her for the first time all evening. Her face was streaked with tears that had nothing to do with joy. The radiant happiness that had defined her expression throughout the ceremony had been replaced by a devastation so complete it took my breath away. "Charlotte understands the difference between sentiment and reality," I said, but my voice lacked conviction now. "She knows what matters in the real world." "No," Charlotte said, her voice stronger now, carrying a steel I'd never heard before. "I understand the difference between love and control, between gratitude and selfishness, between honor and cruelty." She knelt and picked up the fallen compass, cradling it in her hands like a sacred relic. When she stood, her posture had changed. The submissive daughter who'd always deferred to my judgment was gone, replaced by someone I didn't recognize. "Rachel saved my life too," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the ballroom. "Not from roadside bombs or enemy fire, but from becoming someone like you. Someone who measures worth in dollars and social status, who can't see value in anything that doesn't serve their own advancement." The words hit me like physical blows, each one carefully aimed at the foundation of everything I'd built my identity around. My own daughter was destroying me in front of everyone who mattered, choosing the memory of a dead girl over loyalty to the woman who'd given her everything. "I gave you everything," I whispered, the words torn from somewhere deep in my chest. "Harvard, the best society, the perfect marriage. Everything you needed to succeed." "You gave me what you thought I should want," Charlotte replied, tears streaming down her face. "But you never asked what would make me happy. You never cared who I really was, only who you wanted me to become." Rodriguez had been watching this exchange with the patience of someone accustomed to waiting for the right moment to act. Now he stepped forward again, his presence commanding attention from everyone in the ballroom. "Ma'am," he said, addressing me directly, "I think you should know something about the woman you just insulted." He gestured towards Sarah Mitchell, who stood at attention with the kind of dignity I'd spent a lifetime trying to purchase with money and social position. "Lieutenant Commander Mitchell has served 3 combat tours, been decorated for valor under fire, and currently leads a team training local forces in counter-terrorism operations. She's saved more lives than most people will ever meet." He paused, scanning the crowd of influential faces that had gathered to witness my destruction. "But more than that, she's here because she made a promise to a dying friend. She could have been anywhere in the world tonight, but she chose to honor that promise by sharing your daughter's joy." Each word landed with devastating precision, highlighting the contrast between Sarah's selfless journey to Charlotte's wedding and my selfish attempt to control every aspect of the celebration. I could feel my carefully constructed world crumbling around me, the social position I'd spent decades building collapsing under the weight of my own cruelty. "And you," Rodriguez continued, his voice harder now, "you responded to that gesture of love and respect by attacking everything she represents, everything she's sacrificed for, everyone she's served with." The indictment was complete and devastating. I stood exposed before 200 witnesses, my ugliness laid bare for all to see. The powerful friends who'd once competed for my attention were now watching my destruction with fascination and disgust. Sarah Mitchell finally spoke, her voice calm and controlled despite everything I'd put her through. "Mrs. Thornfield, I didn't come here to cause trouble. I came because Rachel loved your daughter, And Charlotte deserved to know how much that friendship meant to someone who gave everything in service to others. She paused, her green eyes meeting mine with a steadiness that made me feel small and petty. I'm sorry you can't see the value in that. I'm sorry you think loving and serving others is somehow beneath your standards. But mostly, I'm sorry for Charlotte, because she deserves better than having her wedding day turned into a platform for hate. The words were delivered without malice, which somehow made them cut deeper than any angry denunciation could have. This woman had maintained her dignity throughout my attack, refusing to descend to my level even when I'd given her every provocation. Behind her, the ballroom had filled with what looked like half the Navy. Men and women in dress uniforms stood in perfect formation, their presence transforming my elegant social gathering into something that resembled a military ceremony. They weren't threatening, exactly, but their collective presence was overwhelming. "Ma'am," Rodriguez said, his voice carrying the weight of final judgment. "I think it's time for you to decide what kind of person you want to be, the kind who learns from this moment, or the kind who doubles down on cruelty because admitting error feels too much like defeat." The choice he offered was impossible. Admitting I'd been wrong would destroy everything I'd built my identity around. But continuing down this path would cost me something even more precious: my daughter's love and respect. I looked around the ballroom at faces I'd known for decades. People whose approval had once seemed like the most important thing in the world. Now they were watching me with expressions ranging from pity to disgust. Their opinion of me shifted forever by what they'd witnessed. Then I looked at Charlotte, my beautiful daughter in her perfect dress, holding a tarnished compass like it was more valuable than all the jewelry I'd ever given her. Her eyes were red with tears, but there was something else there too, a strength I'd never seen before, a certainty about who she was and what she valued. The uniformed figures behind Sarah Mitchell stood silent and patient. Their very presence, a reminder of worlds beyond my comprehension, of values I'd never bothered to understand, of sacrifices I'd dismissed as meaningless. And in that moment, surrounded by the wreckage of my perfect evening, I finally understood the choice I was facing. Not between right and wrong, but between the woman I'd always been and the possibility of becoming someone worthy of my daughter's love. The silence stretched endlessly, filled with the weight of 200 held breaths and the ticking of the antique clock that had witnessed generations of Thornfield celebrations. Everything I'd worked for hung in the balance, waiting for words I wasn't sure I had the courage to speak. My hands trembled as I reached for the champagne glass I'd abandoned when this nightmare began, but my fingers found only empty air. The crystal had shattered when I dropped it, its pieces scattered across the marble floor like the fragments of my carefully constructed life. I began, then stopped, the words catching in my throat like broken glass. Around me, Boston's elite waited, with the kind of fascination usually reserved for train wrecks and political scandals. My humiliation was complete, my social death witnessed by everyone who'd once sought my approval. Charlotte took a step toward me, the compass still clutched in her hand. "Mother," she said softly, "it's not too late to do the right thing. The right thing." Such simple words, but they carried the weight of a choice that would define the rest of my life. I could feel the eyes of the uniformed figures boring into me, their silent judgment more devastating than any angry words. Sarah Mitchell stood perfectly still, her dignity intact, despite everything I'd thrown at her. She was waiting, they were all waiting, for me to find whatever humanity I had left, buried under decades of privilege and pride. "Lieutenant Commander Mitchell," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. The words felt foreign in my mouth, an acknowledgement of authority I'd spent the evening trying to destroy. "I owe you an apology that I'm not sure I'm capable of giving." A ripple went through the crowd, relief and surprise mixing in equal measure. But I wasn't finished. The hardest part was still coming. "Rachel O'Connor," I continued, forcing myself to speak her name with the respect I should have shown from the beginning. "I spoke about her sacrifice with ignorance and cruelty. I dishonored her memory and the service of everyone in this room who has worn our nation's uniform." Each word felt like swallowing broken glass, but I pushed forward. I was wrong. Completely, inexcusably wrong. There is no sacrifice more meaningful than laying down your life for others, and there is no achievement in my world that comes close to the valor your friend showed." Rodriguez nodded slightly, the gesture neither forgiveness nor condemnation, just acknowledgement that I'd finally begun to understand the magnitude of my error. "I have spent my life measuring worth in dollars and social position," I continued, the confession pouring out like poison from a wound. "I taught my daughter that success meant accumulating power and influence, that the only relationships worth maintaining were those that could advance our family's status." I looked at Charlotte, seeing my own failures reflected in her tear-stained face. I was terrified that her friendship with Rachel would remind her of values I couldn't understand, would make her question the life I'd planned for her. So I tried to erase that friendship, to bury those memories under layers of obligation and expectation. The words hung in the air like an indictment, exposing the calculated cruelty that had driven my actions. I had been afraid, I realized, afraid that my daughter might choose meaning over money, service over status, love over advancement. Tonight, I tried to continue that erasure by attacking Lieutenant Commander Mitchell, I said, forcing myself to meet Sarah's eyes. I wanted to drive away anyone who might remind Charlotte of the person she used to be, the person who valued courage and sacrifice over wealth and position. Sarah Mitchell's expression had softened slightly, but she remained silent, letting me complete the confession that was costing me everything I'd thought I valued. "I realize now that I didn't just attack you, Lieutenant Commander. I attacked my own daughter's capacity for love, for gratitude, for honor. I tried to kill the best parts of who she is because they threatened my narrow view of what her life should be." The silence that followed was different now, less charged with anger and more weighted with the possibility of redemption. I could feel the collective breath of the crowd, still held but no longer hostile. "Mrs. Thornfield," Sarah Mitchell said finally, her voice gentle but firm. "Apologies are important, but they're just words. What matters is what you do next." She gestured toward Charlotte, who stood frozen between us like a bridge across an impossible divide. "Your daughter is one of the strongest, most compassionate people I've ever met." Rachel saw that strength, believed in it, died, knowing that people like Charlotte would carry on the work of making the world better. She paused, letting the weight of that sink in. "The question is, will you finally see what Rachel saw, or will you continue trying to diminish her into someone more convenient for your plans?" The challenge was clear and unavoidable. This wasn't just about apologizing for my words. It was about fundamentally changing who I was, how I measured worth, what I valued in life and in my daughter. I looked around the ballroom at the faces of people I'd considered my peers, my social equals, my source of validation. They were watching me with expressions I'd never seen before. Not admiration or envy or even disapproval, but something far more complex. Some showed disgust that might never fade. Others showed a glimmer of respect for the courage it had taken to admit such complete error. But none of their opinions mattered now. The only face that counted was Charlotte's, and the only question that mattered was whether I could find the strength to become worthy of her love. "Charlotte," I said, turning toward my daughter with hands that shook like autumn leaves. "I have been a terrible mother. Not because I didn't love you, but because I loved my idea of who you should be more than who you actually are." She took another step toward me, her wedding dress rustling like hope in the silence. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," I continued. "I don't deserve it, and I'm not sure I've earned the right to ask. But I am asking for the chance to learn, to become someone worthy of the daughter who was strong enough to maintain her values, despite my attempts to corrupt them." The compass in Charlotte's hand caught the light from the chandeliers, its tarnished surface gleaming like a beacon. She held it out toward me, her eyes searching my face for signs of genuine change. "This compass belonged to Rachel's grandfather," she said softly. "He carried it through World War II, through Normandy, and the Battle of the Bulge. When Rachel gave it to me, she said it would always point toward what matters most." Charlotte extended the compass toward me, and I found myself staring at the small, silver instrument with new eyes. The metal was worn smooth by decades of handling, its surface marked with tiny scratches that spoke of journeys through places I could never imagine. This wasn't just a navigational tool. It was a connection to history, to sacrifice, to values that had guided men and women through the darkest moments of human conflict. "Take it," Charlotte whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "See what it shows you." My hands trembled as I accepted the compass, feeling its surprising weight in my palm. The metal was warm from Charlotte's touch, and when I looked down at the face, the needle swung decisively toward the gathered uniformed figures. Not toward wealth, not toward social position, not toward any of the markers I'd spent my life chasing. It pointed toward service, toward sacrifice, toward people who had chosen to value something greater than themselves. Master Chief Rodriguez stepped forward, his presence commanding but no longer threatening. "Mrs. Thornfield, may I tell you something about compass navigation?" I nodded, not trusting my voice to remain steady. "When you're lost in hostile territory," he said, his words carrying the weight of hard-earned experience, "a compass doesn't just show you which way is north. It shows you which way leads home. But you have to trust it, even when the path looks impossible, even when everything around you says you're heading in the wrong direction." He gestured toward the compass in my hands. Rachel's grandfather carried that through some of the worst fighting in World War II. When his unit was surrounded, when they were outnumbered and outgunned, when everything seemed hopeless, that compass showed him the way back to what mattered. Not just geographic home, but moral home. The ballroom around us had become something different than the social battlefield I'd carefully orchestrated. The uniformed figures no longer seemed like invaders threatening my perfect evening. They looked like guardians, protectors of values I'd forgotten how to recognize. Sarah Mitchell moved closer, her earlier anger replaced by something that might have been compassion. "Mrs. Thornfield, Rachel used to tell me about Charlotte's letters from college. How Charlotte would write about feeling lost, about not knowing which direction her life should take. Rachel would hold that compass and tell her that true north wasn't about finding the easiest path or the most profitable one. It was about finding the path that led toward becoming the person you were meant to be." Charlotte's tears were flowing freely now, but they seemed different than the devastation I'd seen earlier. These tears carried relief, as if she'd been holding her breath for years and could finally exhale. "I remember those conversations," Charlotte said, her voice stronger than it had been all evening. "Rachel would tell me that courage wasn't about not being afraid. It was about being terrified and choosing to do the right thing anyway. She said that's what her grandfather taught her, what the compass taught her, every time she looked at it." I stared down at the instrument in my hands, this small piece of metal that had somehow become the center of everything. The needle remained steady, pointing not just toward the uniformed figures, but toward something I was only beginning to understand. A way of measuring worth that had nothing to do with bank accounts or social connections. "I don't understand how to be that person," I admitted, the words coming out in a rush. "I've spent 62 years building my identity around things that suddenly seem hollow and meaningless. I don't know how to value what you value, how to see what you see." Rodriguez exchanged a glance with Sarah Mitchell, some silent communication passing between them. Then he spoke with the kind of authority that comes from leading people through impossible situations. "Ma'am, learning to navigate by moral compass is like learning any other kind of navigation. It takes practice, and it requires admitting when you're lost. The hardest part isn't finding true north, it's having the courage to follow it when it leads away from everything you thought you wanted." He paused, studying my face with eyes that had seen too much to be easily fooled. "The question is, are you willing to be a beginner? Are you willing to let people who understand these things teach you, even if it means acknowledging that your way of seeing the world has been wrong?" The challenge in his words was unmistakable. He wasn't asking me to apologize again. He was asking me to fundamentally change who I was. To become a student instead of the teacher. To follow instead of lead. To value guidance from people I'd spent my life dismissing as irrelevant. Around us, the ballroom held its breath. Boston's social elite watched this unprecedented drama unfold, witnessing the complete dismantling of everything they thought they understood about power and position. Some faces showed fascination, others showed disgust, but all showed the recognition that something fundamental had shifted in their carefully ordered world. "I want to learn," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. I want to understand what I've been missing, what I've been destroying in my daughter and in myself. But I don't know where to start. Sarah Mitchell stepped forward, her expression serious but no longer hostile. It starts with listening, Mrs. Thornfield. Really listening, not just waiting for your turn to speak. It starts with asking questions, instead of making pronouncements. It starts with admitting that there are things more important than being right. She gestured toward the compass, still resting in my palms. Rachel's grandfather used to say that a compass only works if you're willing to move. You can stare at it all day, but unless you're willing to take steps in the direction it shows you, it's just a pretty piece of metal. Charlotte moved closer to me, close enough that I could smell her perfume mixed with the salt of her tears. Mother, do you remember when I came home from college that Christmas during my sophomore year? When I was so different, so troubled about my future. I nodded, remembering how frightened I'd been by the change in her, how desperately I'd worked to pull her back toward the path I'd planned for her life. That was when Rachel and I became friends, Charlotte continued. I was struggling with depression, with feeling like nothing I did mattered, like my life was just a series of expectations I could never live up to. I felt like I was drowning in other people's dreams for me. The words hit me like physical blows, each one a reminder of the pressure I'd put on her, the weight of my ambitions that I'd placed on her shoulders without ever asking if she could carry them. Rachel saved me, Charlotte said simply. Not dramatically, not with some grand gesture, but by showing me that there were other ways to live, other things to value. She taught me that success could mean making a difference in someone else's life, that strength could mean admitting when you need help, that love could mean choosing what's best for someone else even when it costs you everything. She paused, her eyes meeting mine with an intensity that made me feel exposed and small. But you were so afraid of losing the daughter you'd planned that you couldn't see the daughter you actually had. You fought so hard to save me from Rachel's influence that you almost destroyed the parts of me that were worth saving. The indictment was complete and devastating, delivered not with anger but with the kind of sadness that comes from love that has been tested and found wanting. I had been so focused on protecting Charlotte from what I saw as dangerous influences that I'd never stopped to consider what I might be protecting her from, the chance to become someone better than I was. Master Chief Rodriguez cleared his throat, drawing attention back to him with the kind of presence that commanded respect without demanding it. Mrs. Thornfield, may I share something with you about what your daughter meant to Rachel? I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Rachel carried letters from Charlotte through 3 combat deployments, he said, his voice carrying across the silent ballroom. When things got bad, when we were taking fire or dealing with casualties, she would read those letters and tell us about this girl back home who was learning to be brave, learning to care about things bigger than herself. He paused, letting the weight of that sink in. Rachel used to say that Charlotte gave her hope that the world she was fighting for was worth the sacrifice, that there were people back home who understood what service meant, who wouldn't let the lessons be lost. Each word was a revelation, a glimpse into a relationship I'd never understood, a friendship I'd tried so hard to diminish that I'd nearly destroyed its legacy entirely. Charlotte had been Rachel's anchor to home, her reminder of why the fight mattered, and I'd almost succeeded in severing that connection permanently. When Rachel died, Rodriguez continued, her last words were about making sure Charlotte knew how proud she was of her. Not for the grades, or the achievements, or the social status, but for the courage to keep choosing kindness even when the world seemed determined to reward cruelty. Charlotte was sobbing now, her carefully applied makeup ruined by tears that seemed to come from some deep well of grief and relief. The compass lay forgotten in my hands as I watched my daughter mourn for a friend whose memory I'd tried to erase. Sarah Mitchell moved to Charlotte's side, offering the kind of comfort that comes from shared understanding. Rachel kept every letter you wrote, she told Charlotte gently. She said reading them was like getting messages from the person she hoped to become when she came home. The image that created was almost unbearable, a young woman in a war zone, drawing strength from letters from my daughter, planning a future that would never come while fighting to protect strangers she would never meet. I had dismissed her sacrifice as meaningless, when in reality it had been the most meaningful thing imaginable. "I want to read them," I said suddenly, the words surprising even me. "The letters, I mean. If that's possible, if they still exist, I want to read them. I want to understand what my daughter meant to your friend." Sarah Mitchell studied my face with the kind of careful assessment that military personnel learn to make quickly and accurately. "They exist," she said finally. "Rachel's personal effects were returned to her family, but they made copies of Charlotte's letters before giving them to me. They thought someday Charlotte might want to see how much her friendship meant." She paused, her expression serious. "But reading them isn't going to be easy, Mrs. Thornfield. They're full of the kind of hope and idealism and genuine caring that you've spent this evening dismissing as worthless. If you're going to read them, you need to be prepared to see your daughter through Rachel's eyes, to understand what you almost destroyed." The warning was clear. This wasn't going to be a comfortable journey of discovery. These letters would show me everything I'd failed to see in my own daughter, everything I'd tried to change or suppress, everything I'd valued less than social advancement and financial security. "I'm prepared," I said, though I wasn't sure that was true. "I need to understand. I need to see what I've been blind to." Rodriguez nodded approvingly. "Understanding is the first step, ma'am. But it's only the first step. The real question is what you're going to do with that understanding." He gestured toward the gathered uniformed figures, men and women who had somehow filled my ballroom without my noticing, their presence transforming the space into something that felt more like a chapel than a party venue. "These people didn't come here tonight to embarrass you or to ruin your daughter's wedding," he said. "They came because someone they respected made a promise, and they wanted to make sure that promise was kept. They came because service members don't abandon each other, even in death." The simple dignity of that statement hit me harder than any of the anger or condemnation I'd faced earlier. These people weren't here for revenge or dramatic confrontation. They were here because they understood loyalty in ways I'd never bothered to learn. "Lieutenant Commander Mitchell could have delivered that compass privately," Rodriguez continued. "She could have avoided this entire scene, could have fulfilled her promise without risking the kind of humiliation you put her through. But Charlotte specifically invited her to share this moment because she wanted Rachel's memory to be part of her wedding day." He paused, his eyes meeting mine with steady intensity. "Your daughter was trying to honor her friend's sacrifice by including the people who served with her in one of the most important moments of her life. That's the kind of person Rachel helped her become. The question is, what kind of person are you going to choose to be?" The choice he offered was stark and unavoidable. I could continue being the woman who had attacked a war veteran at her own daughter's wedding, or I could become someone worthy of the daughter Charlotte had always been underneath my attempts to reshape her. Around us, the ballroom remained silent except for the soft sound of Charlotte's tears and the almost inaudible whisper of fabric as the uniformed figures maintained their respectful attention. These men and women had seen combat, had faced death and loss and unimaginable hardship, yet they stood here with the kind of dignity I'd never learned to achieve. "I want to be better," I said, the words coming from somewhere deeper than pride or social calculation. "I want to be the kind of mother who deserves a daughter like Charlotte, the kind of person who can honor sacrifice instead of mocking it." Sarah Mitchell stepped forward, her expression thoughtful. "Mrs. Thornfield, that's not something that happens overnight. It's not something you can buy or arrange or socially engineer. It requires changing not just how you act, but how you think, how you value things, what you consider important." She gestured toward the compass still resting in my hands. "That compass has guided 3 generations through some of the darkest moments in American history. It's pointed the way home for people who thought they'd never see their families again. But it only works if you trust it more than you trust your own sense of direction." The metaphor was clear and challenging. I had spent my entire adult life trusting my own judgment, my own values, my own understanding of what mattered. The idea of surrendering that control, of following guidance from people I'd previously dismissed, was terrifying. But the alternative was worse. The alternative was remaining the woman who had humiliated a war veteran, who had tried to erase her daughter's most meaningful friendship, who valued social status more than human dignity. "How do I start?" I asked, the question coming out smaller and more vulnerable than I'd intended. How do I learn to see what you see, to value what you value? Rodriguez and Sarah Mitchell exchanged another of those silent communications, years of shared experience compressed into a single glance. Then Rodriguez spoke with the kind of authority that comes from leading people through impossible transformations. You start by listening to the stories, ma'am. Really listening. Not just waiting to judge or correct or improve. You start by understanding that every person in uniform has made choices that put others before themselves, and those choices deserve respect, regardless of how they fit into your worldview. He paused, studying my face with the intensity of someone accustomed to assessing whether people could be trusted with important responsibilities. But more than that, you start by understanding that your daughter already knows these things. She learned them from Rachel, internalized them, despite your attempts to redirect her toward more practical concerns. If you want to learn to navigate by moral compass, she's probably the best teacher you could ask for. The idea was simultaneously humbling and hopeful. My daughter as teacher, guiding me toward values she'd learned from a friend I'd tried to erase. It would require completely reversing our relationship, acknowledging that she had wisdom I lacked, strength I'd never developed. Charlotte looked up at me through her tears, and for the first time all evening I saw something that might have been hope in her eyes. "Would you really want that?" she asked softly. "Would you really want me to teach you about Rachel? About what she meant to me? About what I learned from her?" The question hung between us like a bridge across an impossible divide. Saying yes would mean admitting that my daughter had access to wisdom I'd never possessed, that her college friendship had taught her things my decades of experience couldn't match. "Yes," I said, the word coming out with surprising firmness. "I want to learn from you. I want to understand what I've been missing, what I've been fighting against, what I almost destroyed." Charlotte stepped closer, close enough that I could see the hope beginning to overcome the devastation in her eyes. "It won't be easy," she warned. "Learning about Rachel means learning about sacrifice and service and putting others first. It means understanding that some things are more important than money or status or social position." She paused, her voice growing stronger. "It means accepting that the life you planned for me might not be the life that would make me happy, and being okay with that even if it disappoints you." The challenge was enormous and terrifying. Everything I'd worked for, everything I'd built my identity around, would have to be reevaluated through the lens of values I'd never bothered to understand. But the alternative was losing Charlotte entirely, watching her build a life that honored her friend's memory while excluding the mother who had tried to destroy that memory. "I'm willing to learn," I said, looking around the ballroom at faces that no longer seemed hostile but rather patient, as if they were waiting to see whether I could prove worthy of their time and attention. "I'm willing to be taught by people who understand things I don't." Master Chief Rodriguez nodded slowly. "That's a start, ma'am. But understanding and being willing to change are different things. The real test comes when you have to choose between your old way of thinking and what you're learning, especially when that choice costs you something you thought you couldn't live without." His words carried the weight of prophecy, a warning that the journey I was beginning would require sacrifices I couldn't yet imagine. But as I looked at Charlotte's face, seeing the hope beginning to outweigh the hurt, I knew that no sacrifice could be greater than losing my daughter's love and respect. Sarah Mitchell stepped forward one final time, her expression serious but no longer guarded. "Mrs. Thornfield, if you're serious about this, if you really want to understand what Rachel meant to Charlotte and what that friendship taught her, then I have something that might help." She reached into her uniform jacket and withdrew a small leather journal, worn soft by handling. This was Rachel's diary from her final deployment. She wrote about Charlotte constantly, about the letters she received, about the hope they gave her. "If you want to understand what you almost destroyed tonight, you need to read this." She held the journal out toward me, but didn't immediately release it when I reached for it. "But I need you to understand something first. This isn't just about Rachel's thoughts and feelings. This is about a young woman facing death every day and finding the strength to continue because she believed there were people like Charlotte back home who made the fight worthwhile." The weight of responsibility in her words was overwhelming. This wasn't just about reading someone's private thoughts. It was about understanding the role my daughter had played in sustaining someone through the ultimate test of courage and commitment. Reading this will show you exactly what kind of person your daughter really is, Sarah continued. Not the person you wanted her to become, but the person she chose to be despite your efforts to change her. The question is, will you be able to accept and celebrate that person, or will you continue trying to remake her into something more convenient for your plans? I took the journal with hands that shook like autumn leaves, feeling the weight of years of friendship and sacrifice compressed into its small pages. The leather was soft and warm, marked with stains that might have been water or tears or dust from a dozen foreign battlefields. "I'll read it," I promised, my voice stronger than I'd expected. "I'll read it and I'll listen and I'll try to understand what I've been missing." Charlotte stepped closer, close enough to place her hand over mine where it held the journal. "Mother, Rachel used to write about believing that people could change, that even the hardest hearts could learn to see differently if they were willing to try. She believed that about everyone she met, even the people who seemed impossible to reach." Her words carried a challenge and a promise, the challenge to prove worthy of such faith, and the promise that change was possible even for someone as set in her ways as I had become. The ballroom around us had become something entirely different than the social battlefield I'd prepared for my daughter's wedding. It had become a classroom where I was finally ready to be a student, a chapel where I could begin to understand what real service looked like, a courtroom where I could start making amends for the damage I'd done. The compass lay warm in my palm, its needle pointing steadily toward true north, toward values I was only beginning to glimpse. And for the first time in my adult life, I was ready to follow where it led, even if the path took me away from everything I thought I knew about success and worth, and what it meant to be a good mother. The journey toward becoming worthy of my daughter's love was going to be the hardest thing I'd ever attempted. But as I looked at Charlotte's face, seeing the hope that was slowly replacing the hurt, I knew it was also going to be the most important. 3 months later, I stood in the modest apartment that Sarah Mitchell called home, surrounded by boxes of memorabilia that told the story of a friendship I'd nearly destroyed. The walls were bare except for a single framed photograph, Rachel O'Connor and Charlotte, arms around each other's shoulders, laughing at something beyond the camera's view. They looked so young, so full of hope and possibility, so completely unaware that one of them had only months left to live. Sarah emerged from the bedroom carrying another cardboard box, this one labeled Charlotte's Letters in Rachel's careful handwriting. We'd been going through Rachel's belongings for hours now, and each item revealed another layer of the relationship I'd tried so hard to erase from my daughter's life. "This is the last box," Sarah said, setting it down on her small kitchen table with the reverence of someone handling sacred relics. Rachel kept everything Charlotte sent her. Every letter, every card, every photograph. She said they were her connection to the world she was fighting to protect. I approached the box slowly, my hands still trembling slightly as they had for weeks now. The journey toward understanding had been more difficult than I'd anticipated, each revelation about my daughter's friendship with Rachel forcing me to confront another aspect of my own blindness and cruelty. The first letter was dated from Charlotte's sophomore year at Harvard, written in her careful script on cream-colored stationery that bore the Thornfield family crest. Even then, I'd been training her to present herself as belonging to a certain class, to never forget the symbols that marked her as different from ordinary people. "Dear Rachel," the letter began, "I keep thinking about our conversation last night about what it means to live a meaningful life. You asked me what I wanted to be remembered for, and I realized I've never actually thought about that question. My mother has plans for me, detailed blueprints for success, that don't leave much room for personal choice." The words hit me like physical blows. Even at 19, Charlotte had felt trapped by my expectations, suffocated by the future I'd designed for her, without ever asking what she wanted for herself. The letter continued. "You said something that's been echoing in my head for days. You said that courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about being terrified and doing the right thing anyway. I've been afraid my entire life, Rachel. Afraid of disappointing people. Afraid of making the wrong choice, afraid of not living up to the image everyone has of who I should be." Sarah sat across from me at the small table, watching my face as I read. She'd grown gentler with me over these past months, patient in ways I didn't deserve, as she guided me through the wreckage of my own making. She was struggling with her identity, Sarah explained quietly. Rachel used to tell me that Charlotte felt like she was living someone else's life, following someone else's dreams. She was battling depression, feeling like nothing she did mattered because it wasn't what she actually wanted to do. I continued reading, my daughter's words from years ago painting a picture of suffering I'd been too self-absorbed to notice. I watch you preparing for deployment, and I'm amazed by your sense of purpose. You know exactly why you're doing what you're doing, exactly what you're willing to sacrifice, and why it's worth it. I envy that certainty. I feel like I'm floating through life, checking boxes on someone else's list of achievements. The letter was dated just weeks before Charlotte had come home for Christmas that year, the visit when I'd noticed such dramatic changes in her personality. I'd been alarmed by her questions about the meaning of success, her sudden interest in volunteer work, her apparent lack of enthusiasm for the internships and networking opportunities I'd arranged. Now I understood that those changes hadn't been symptoms of some dangerous influence corrupting my daughter. They'd been signs of a young woman finally beginning to discover who she really was, guided by a friend who understood the difference between living and merely existing. The next letter was written after Charlotte had returned to Harvard, following that Christmas break. Rachel, thank you for helping me see that I don't have to choose between loving my family and being true to myself. I know my mother means well, but she's built her entire identity around a certain vision of success, and she can't imagine that anyone might want something different. I set the letter down, my vision blurring with tears that had become all too familiar over these past months. Charlotte had been protecting me even then, making excuses for my behavior while struggling to find her own path forward. Sarah reached across the table and placed her hand over mine. She never stopped loving you, Mrs. Thornfield. Even when Rachel would get frustrated with some of the pressure Charlotte was under, Charlotte would always defend you. She'd say that you'd worked so hard to give her opportunities that you couldn't understand why she might not want them. The kindness in Sarah's voice made the tears flow harder. Over these months of learning about Rachel and Charlotte's friendship, Sarah had become something I'd never expected. A friend. Not the kind of superficial social connection I'd cultivated for decades, but someone who cared enough to help me become a better person even when it cost her time and emotional energy. We continued through the letters chronologically, watching Charlotte's growth through Rachel's eyes. The depression began to lift as Charlotte found ways to channel her desire for meaningful work within the constraints of her family obligations. She started tutoring underprivileged children, volunteering at veterans, hospitals, finding small ways to make a difference while still maintaining the academic excellence I demanded. Rachel was so proud of her, Sarah said as we read about Charlotte's volunteer work. She'd write back about how Charlotte was learning to serve others in her own way, how she was finding purpose within the life she'd been given, rather than abandoning it entirely. One letter from Charlotte's junior year stopped me cold. I had dinner with Mother last night, and she was going on about the importance of marrying well, of choosing a husband who could advance our family's position. I wanted to tell her that I've learned there are more important things than social advancement, but I couldn't find the words that wouldn't hurt her. Even then, Charlotte had been protecting me from the truth about how my values appeared to someone who'd learned to see the world differently. She'd been carefully managing our relationship, showing me only the parts of herself that I could accept while hiding the growth that Rachel had inspired. Sarah pulled out a small wooden box from the bottom of the cardboard container. Rachel kept these separately, she said, opening it to reveal a stack of photographs that Charlotte had sent over the years. She said they reminded her what she was fighting for. The photographs showed Charlotte's transformation from the carefully posed society girl I'd raised into someone more genuine, more comfortable in her own skin. There were pictures from her volunteer work, images of her laughing with children at the veterans hospital, shots of her at rallies for causes I'd considered beneath our family's notice. She was becoming the person she was meant to be, I whispered, studying a photograph of Charlotte teaching a literacy class at a community center. Her face glowed with the kind of joy I'd never seen when she was attending the charity galas and society events I'd insisted were important. Yes, Sarah agreed. And Rachel was so grateful to be part of that journey, even from thousands of miles away. She used to say that watching Charlotte find her true self gave her hope that the world she was fighting to protect was worth all the sacrifice. We found Rachel's final letter from Charlotte, written just weeks before Rachel's death. I've been thinking about something you said about courage being a choice we make every day, not just in dramatic moments. I'm trying to find small ways to be brave, to choose kindness over convenience, to choose meaning over approval. The letter continued. I know you're facing things I can't imagine, but I want you to know that you've already changed my life in ways that will ripple outward for decades. The children I tutor, the veterans I visit, the causes I support quietly, all of that exists because you taught me to look beyond my own comfort and see the needs of others. Rachel had died before she could read that letter. It had been returned with her personal effects, undelivered but treasured by her family as evidence of the profound impact she'd had on someone she'd never expected to see again. She never knew, I said, my voice breaking on the words. Rachel never knew how much she'd changed Charlotte's life. Sarah wiped her own tears away with the back of her hand. I think she knew. Rachel had this gift for seeing potential in people, for believing in their capacity to grow into something better than they thought possible. She believed in Charlotte from the moment they met. As we packed the letters back into their box, I felt the weight of everything I'd almost destroyed settling on my shoulders like a physical burden. These weren't just memories of a college friendship. They were evidence of my daughter's transformation into someone worthy of respect and admiration, someone who'd learned to use her privileges in service of others. Sarah, I said as we prepared to leave her apartment, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. She turned toward me, her expression serious but patient. Do you think I can actually change? Not just apologize or make amends, but fundamentally become a different kind of person? The kind of person who deserves a daughter like Charlotte? Sarah was quiet for a long moment, studying my face with the careful assessment I'd learned to recognize over our months together. Finally, she spoke with the same honesty she'd shown from the beginning. Mrs. Thornfield, 3 months ago I thought you were beyond redemption. I thought you were the kind of person who could never see past your own privilege and prejudice. But watching you go through Rachel's letters, seeing how you've struggled with every revelation about what you almost destroyed, I think you're already changing. She paused, her expression growing more serious. But change isn't just about feeling bad about the past, or understanding what you did wrong. Real change means choosing to act differently even when it costs you something you value, even when it means admitting you were wrong in front of people whose opinions matter to you. Her words carried the weight of challenge and possibility in equal measure. Over these months, I'd begun to understand the depth of my failures. But understanding wasn't the same as transformation. The real test, Sarah continued, will come when you have to choose between your old way of thinking and what you've learned. When you have to decide whether to support Charlotte's choices even if they disappoint your expectations, whether to value service over status, whether to measure success by impact rather than income. I nodded, feeling the truth of her words settling into my bones. The journey toward becoming worthy of my daughter's love would require not just understanding what I'd done wrong, but actively choosing to do better, even when those choices challenged everything I'd built my identity around. That evening, I sat in my study, surrounded by the wealth and privilege that had once seemed like the most important things in the world. The antique furniture, the original artwork, the first edition books that had impressed countless guests over the years, all of it felt somehow smaller now, less significant than the worn letters and faded photographs I'd spent the day reading. Charlotte had called earlier to invite me to dinner the following week, not at some exclusive restaurant where we could be seen by the right people, but at her apartment where we could talk privately about everything I'd learned from Rachel's letters. The invitation felt like a gift I hadn't earned but was grateful to receive. The compass that had started this entire journey sat on my desk, its silver surface reflecting the lamplight. The needle pointed steadily north, just as it had for 3 generations of people who'd learned to trust its guidance through impossible circumstances. I picked it up, feeling its familiar weight in my palm, and thought about the path it was showing me. Not toward social advancement or financial gain, but toward becoming someone my daughter could respect, Someone worthy of the friendship Sarah Mitchell had offered. Someone who could honor rather than diminish the memory of a young woman who died protecting others. The journey was far from over. I still struggled daily with impulses toward judgment and social calculation that had been ingrained over decades of careful conditioning. But for the first time in my adult life, I had a clear sense of the direction I wanted to travel, guided by values I was finally beginning to understand. Tomorrow I would begin the next phase of this transformation, learning to be the kind of mother Charlotte deserved, the kind of person who could carry forward the lessons Rachel had died protecting, the kind of human being who measured worth by service rather than status. The compass needle remained steady, pointing toward true north, toward home, toward the person I was finally ready to become. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.